All right, so something else that also deviates from Mendelian genetics are sex-linked traits. And this is where um, Thomas Hunt Morgan gets a lot of his credit for his Nobel Prize. Um, we look at sex determination, right? And it's your combination of having an X versus a Y chromosome. If I look at somebody who is XX, right? It's a female, XY, it's a male. So ultimately, when I look at this, who's deciding the gender of the offspring? Well, I'll go back to your meiotic division, right? Mom can only ever give an X, so she will provide that to her daughter or to her son. Dad's ultimately the one who decides because he can give the X, in which case he has a daughter, and if he gives the Y, then he ends up with a son. Just a sort of throwing this out there, we talk so much about the X and Y system in biology and yet fail to mention that there are different sex determination systems found in other organisms. Something like the grasshopper and certain insects work off of an X0 system. Double X would be a female, only having a single X actually makes you male, which is kind of an interesting setup. Certain avian species, bird species, work off of a ZY system, ZW system, where unlike us having two of the same is female, that's actually what we're seeing with a double Z and a male in their system, and the ZW is a female. And then there are also organisms like our honeybees that work off of a haploid versus diploid system. So being diploid makes you sort of the queen of your hive and you're a female, while all the worker bees are actually haploid and male, which is kind of just something to think about. So why is this coming up in the sense of talking about these exceptions to Mendelian genetics? Well, when we look at your X versus Y chromosome, there are genes that are inherited on these chromosomes. So we look at the X chromosome. In fact, we know about 1,100 genes, give or take, many of which are actually connected to genetic disorders. So I find some sort of mutation in there. It's now being inherited throughout the population, and we know that they're connected to recessive genetic disorders, things like muscular dystrophy, to hemophilia, to not necessarily detrimental, but red-green color blindness is also a trait that we find on the X chromosome. If we look at your Y chromosome, on the other hand, it's about a third of the size and has about 250 known genes. So, point being, not every gene that is located on your sex chromosomes is necessarily related to sex, especially when I look at the X chromosome itself. Y chromosome overarchingly connected to the production of male genitalia and testosterone and things like that. But the X chromosome has a lot more information and a lot more diversity in it. So when we look at a gene that is located on either sex chromosome, X or Y, we talk about it as a sex-linked gene. It is a gene that will ultimately get connected to your gender, biologically speaking. And most of the sex-linked genes, sex-linked traits that we talk about, overwhelmingly end up on the X chromosome simply because it has far more information and far more space than the Y chromosome does. That being said, it's not impossible to have a sex-linked gene on a Y chromosome. So why does this matter? Well, because when we look at the expression of sex-linked traits, it actually differs in our expectation because now I have to take into consideration, am I talking about a female versus a male? So when I look at a female, because she inherits two X's, she is capable of being homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive for that characteristic. Just like any other typical trait we talk about, she is capable of being a carrier. Remember, carriers are your heterozygote individuals. A male, on the other hand, cannot be a carrier for a sex-linked trait. If it's not sex-linked, it's anywhere autosomal, anywhere else in our genome, then both males and females are equally likely to be carriers. But in a sex-linked scenario, females can be carriers, males cannot. Why? Because a male only has one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. And since the vast majority of characteristics we talk about as sex-linked traits are on the X chromosome, there's no second X for a male to have the ability to mask a recessive trait with a dominant one. So males have no second copy to mask the trait, and that's why we see them overwhelmingly affecting more males than they will females in a particular population. So eye color in fruit flies, this is what Morgan was looking at, and this is how he discovered it. So if I take a parent generation where my female has red eyes, so the dominant trait, and I have a white-eyed male, I go through my F1 generation and it looks just like anything else. I'd expect them all to be red eyes because they'd get a dominant and a recessive. And that's what happens. Male versus female, nothing different or weird looks like that here. But I go down to my F2 generation, I still have a 3-to-1 ratio, but if you look at the differentiation between male versus female, all of my females have red eyes, and it's the males now that have the 50-50 split. And that's where Morgan really got a lot of his praise, a lot of his credit for recognizing that that's what was happening. That when he was looking at those ratios, although he may have still been seeing his traditional 3-to-1 in the population as a whole, overwhelmingly all of the truly recessive characteristics were all showing up in his male organisms. So when we look at sex-linked disorders, things like the red-green color blindness, like the hemophilia, male pattern baldness, we're looking at these disorders that are way more common in men than they are in women. Other interesting thing while we're on the topic of this sex-linked conversation is the fact that you technically only need one X chromosome to survive. Period. If you were to have had some sort of mistake happen in meiosis, non-disjunction occur, and you only ever received a single X chromosome, you'd be fine, and you would be biologically female. And that's because there's no necessity for a female to express both copies of her X chromosomes. And so what she does is randomly throughout her body during embryonic development, one of the X's in the cell gets shut down. It gets compressed, right? It gets deactivated. And so if I were to pull a particular skin cell out of the tip of your finger, if you're a female, and then pull another one out of your spinal cord and another one out of your intestines, we may actually see that it's not always the same X chromosome that has been deactivated in those tissues. So this sets up an interesting example. If I look at you as a human, there's nothing that's going to be able to tell me that just by looking at you which X chromosome got shut down. But there are some organisms that you can, and cocalico cats are a great example of being able to see this phenotypic expression of the shutdown of certain X chromosomes. So if I look at cocalico cats, right, their particular allele for the orange versus black fur color actually occurs on their X chromosome. So when the female is developing, certain patches will shut down one X chromosome versus the other. So if she was a heterozygote, meaning she had both copies, orange and black, then in the patches where her orange X chromosome remained active, remained uncondensed, she's got that orange color. However, you go to another patch on her, and this is where the patchiness comes from. The orange one was the one inactivated. Actively, the black is still the one expressed, and that's where you get this. And so if you ever see a cocalico cat, it has to be female. Males are not capable of doing this because if they shut down their X chromosome, they're done. All right, there's no way for them to be able to survive, so they don't do it. It's just kind of an interesting outlier since we're talking about sex chromosomes here. So when we shut down that chromosome, we look at them or we talk about them as bar bodies. So in this one, this particular chromosome is the bar body. In this particular cell, this is our bar body, the one that gets shut down, the one that gets condensed. Interesting thing, when she goes through that meiotic division to make her gametes, to make her egg cells, in that process, both of these chromosomes become reactivated so that when her gametes get produced, it doesn't matter whether she passes on the X chromosome that's orange or the X chromosome that's black. Both will get reactivated in that egg cell so that when her offspring get produced, they have a functional X chromosome. So once again, why can't I do this? Well, because males only have one X. They need all the information to be expressed on that X chromosome to be a functional organism. And so if a male is missing that active X chromosome, they just don't survive. So go back to that idea of non-disjunction again and some sort of mutation happening. It is impossible for a viable cell to produce an offspring if only the Y is present. So that means that there has to be an X at least. All right, if there's two X's, then we know it's a traditional female. XY is traditional male, but they have to have at least one functional X to survive.